Hey everyone, I'm your host Adrian. We do content like this weekly, so hit the subscribe button and ring the bell to get notified. If you want more content like this, click the like button and please leave a comment. Thanks again for watching. Let's go ahead and jump right in. Super excited for today's conversation with Dr. Jacoby, but welcome to today's Rupa Live class presented by Rupa University, the best way to learn about specialty lab works from industry experts. My name is Adrian Martinez, and I will be your host for this evening. Thank you so much for joining us during this special time slot. Today, we have a very special guest in Dr. Nirala Jacoby here to talk about breath test interpretation for different SIBO patterns. Before jumping in, a couple of quick housekeeping items to go over. Everyone joining will be muted by default, but if you have any questions, go ahead and use that Q&A button down in your menu bar, and we'll go ahead and ask Dr. Jacoby after her presentation. Immediately following the Q&A, yours truly will show you exactly how to order these SIBO tests through Rupa Health. And if you have to jump early, no worries at all. We are recording this session as we always do, and we will go ahead and distribute that within the coming days, as well as you can find the recording on rupauniversity.com. Speaking of recordings, you can find access and get access to all the previous sessions that we have done on rupauniversity.com if you're interested in this type of content. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in. I'd like to introduce Dr. Nirala Jacoby. Dr. Jacoby is a naturopathic doctor and internationally recognized expert on small intestine bacterial overgrowth, or as we all know it, SIBO. She is the creator of SIBO biphasic diet, a resource that has helped tens of thousands of SIBO sufferers around the world. Dr. Jacoby is the host of the SIBO Doctor podcast and the founder of the SIBO Doctor, an online educational platform that includes a practitioner certification program. In Australia, she is also the medical director of SIBO Test, providing innovative testing options for SIBO and IBS. Dr. Jacoby is known for her systematic and effective approach to diagnosing and treating SIBOs and other functional digestive disorders. Having received her naturopathic doctorate in 1998 from the esteemed Bastyr University in Seattle, we love Bastyr, she brings more than 2 decades of clinical experience and expertise to her clinic, the Biome Clinic on the East Coast of Australia. Dr. Jacoby, we are so excited to have you with us here this morning for you. I'll go ahead and let you take it from here.
Great. Thank you, Adrian. And like I said, I wish I could see everybody's faces in the context of a conference, but it's great to connect to everybody across the United States and potentially worldwide. So my journey to SIBO came about back in 2011 when I first learned about SIBO. And I, probably like many of you, was sort of flabbergasted that I'd never heard about SIBO at the time. And as a naturopathic physician, we really pride ourselves in our knowledge of the digestive tract, but I'd never heard about SIBO. So I endeavored to learn everything about it. And at the time, SIBO wasn't a recognized condition, and it's arguably still not a very recognized condition in conventional medical settings. But so what I did is basically, once I started to learn everything about it, I also started a breath testing company here in Australia and really began to see a lot of breath testing interpretation. So some of what you'll learn today is based on my experience with breath testing, and some of it comes from my cases, and then there's just a lot of research as well. So this is just my disclosure. I do own a breath testing facility in Australia, and I have an educational platform. But just to reiterate the learning objectives that probably came with your registration, it's really to accurately diagnose SIBO and IMO on breath testing. Let me just move all of my little windows here. I can't actually read stuff. Using the breath test, and the breath test is a very useful tool, I find, in clinical setting. Also to understand the nuances of test interpretation in diagnosis, and also how your patient is responding to the treatment you're giving them. And then also to understand why retesting can be important after treatment. I'm a big fan of that. And then learn about intestinal methanogen overgrowth, or IMO, and how this differs from SIBO. I actually think that SIBO in general is a bit overdiagnosed. personally. I think that, and understand also common causes of SIBO and how these may require different relapse prevention strategies. In my education, I talk a lot about relapse prevention and talk about the underlying causes. And I think this is where we really shine as naturopathic physicians, functional practitioners. This is our goal, I hope, is that we really treat somebody's underlying cause to SIBO. Because personally, I find that treating bacteria is not difficult, right? We know what to do for the bacteria. So just for those of you joining that might be looking for how to treat SIBO, I'm not going to get into that at all. I'm really just talking about breath testing as well as looking at some underlying causes. So when we talk about SIBO, we understand it's bacterial overgrowth of the small intestine. And there are different types of SIBO based on breath testing. And that would be a hydrogen dominant breath test, methane dominant. We see mixed hydrogen and methane patterns. And we also now have a newcomer with hydrogen sulfide, which is a relatively new test that's being offered by only one lab right now in America. But let's just briefly revisit or talk about what happens in the gut with bacterial fermentation. So it all sort of starts with hydrogen production that's being produced in the small intestine by an overgrowth, typically of Klebsiella and E. coli. So that's not a normal occurrence that those 2 gram-negative bacteria overgrow in the gut. But in the case of SIBO, this has been now established that it's mainly Klebsiella pneumoniae and E. coli. So what happens is we have another organism called Methanobrevibacter smithii that's actually an archaea that utilizes some of that hydrogen to produce methane. There is some newer research that looks at other kinds of organisms that might be providing hydrogen to M. smithii, but for the sake of argument, we're going to talk about hydrogen use by different organisms to produce different gases. So we already know that in order to have methane present, you need to also have hydrogen bacteria present, because that's how methane gets produced. Typically, you require 4 hydrogen molecules or atoms to produce 1 molecule of methane. The second one, hydrogen sulfide, so Desulfovibrio species and Fusobacteria species use the hydrogen to produce hydrogen sulfide, and then you can just have hydrogen by itself that can be detected on a breath test. So typically when we talk about SIBO, or breath testing, we don't really talk about stool patterns because it is a breath test, and typically we don't really use stool testing at all to diagnose SIBO. That's a really important take home. You can't really determine that with a stool test, but we do see typical stool patterns with the different SIBO presentations. So typically if somebody has a hydrogen dominant type of SIBO, you classically are going to see more diarrhea or mixed bowel patterns. If they also have some methane on the breath test, you typically can see a bit more constipation with that. And if it's just methane dominance, we see more constipation. And then hydrogen sulfide, which is a smaller subset of the SIBO that we're seeing. It's actually, I haven't seen it very often to have hydrogen sulfide be present on the breath test. So it's a smaller subset, and we typically see more diarrhea if this patient has an overgrowth of either Desulfovibrio or Fusobacterium in the small intestine, or we actually can see more constipation in the case of what we call LIBO, which is large intestine bacterial overgrowth of these types of hydrogen sulfide producers. So it really depends on where that hydrogen sulfide bacteria is dominant. But for the sake of just talking about breath tests and SIBO, these are the classic more bowel patterns that I see in my patient population with these patterns. So what is breath testing? Why are we excited about breath testing? Well, number one is really the convenience, I think, for patients. They don't have to do any really extreme sampling of stool or blood, and it can be done at home. It's very convenient. But typically what it is basically your patient does a prep diet for the day before, an overnight fast, and in the morning they ingest a substrate. And typically that substrate is lactulose or glucose, or some practitioners also use fructose. And what happens is that that substrate, which is basically a fuel source for bacteria, is fermented by these small intestinal bacteria into hydrogen, methane, or hydrogen sulfide gas, which are then absorbed into circulation and carried to the lungs. And that's where the breath test comes in, because every 15 to 20 minutes, when the patient is sampling the breath test or sampling the breath, we're capturing different levels of gas potentially. So that's really the background of what we're actually testing. So the primary test substrate for the breath test is lactulose, and in most of the research that's being used is lactulose. But not every bacteria ferments lactulose equally. So sometimes you can actually have a negative lactulose breath test and the patient is still positive for SIBO. And so this is why some practitioners opt for testing with both lactulose and glucose. So typically, first you do one, and then you go back to the prep diet and then overnight fast, and the next day you would do the glucose test. Glucose is actually is an excellent substrate, but our physiology is such that glucose gets absorbed so rapidly from the small intestine that oftentimes it misses the distal part of the small intestine. And so distal SIBO can be missed with glucose. So some practitioners therefore don't really use glucose very much, but I have definitely found SIBO presence and glucose positive test results in patients that were highly suspicious of SIBO but had a negative lactulose. So always consider that before thinking that the patient is negative. So think about running a follow-up with the glucose. And then some practitioners prefer to cast their net as wide as possible and do the triad of testing, which includes fructose as a test sugar. Now, before this consensus, which is the North American consensus that was done in 2017, that tried to give guidelines as to test interpretations and what constitutes a positive and what constitutes a negative. We had sort of limited guidelines and really were, and that's still up to debate to some extent, but this gives us some guidelines as to how we should really interpret breath testing. But the conclusion really was that breath testing is a useful, inexpensive, simple, and safe diagnostic test in the evaluation of common gastroenterology problems. And especially when we're talking about lactulose was always deemed as only a measure of motility, and that has now, I believe, been debunked to some extent. So it was good to have some consensus, but I don't think the road should end there. We do need a few more guidelines as it comes to hydrogen sulfide and all of that has not really had the attention yet. So let's talk about how you should prep your patient, because I am a big fan of proper prepping, because that's going to give you the most accurate results. And at SIBO Test, we have very strict guidelines where people really are removing all fermentable carbohydrates for about a 24-hour period before the test, and potentially longer if that patient is constipated. So, but typically for a month prior, you know, if that patient has had a colonoscopy 2 weeks ago, you want to wait another 2 weeks before you recommend breath testing. And if they've had antibiotics in the month leading up to the test, you also want to avoid the antibiotics for a whole month, unless you've used the antibiotics for treatment of SIBO. Which then it's recommended that you repeat the test pretty much immediately after using antibiotics as well as herbal antimicrobials, simply because you're actually checking the efficacy of those prescriptions or the herbal antimicrobials, so that you can actually gauge relapse rate. A week prior to the test, you want to stop any kind of probiotic. And I include the fermented foods like yogurt and sauerkraut and kimchi and kombucha and that type of stuff. Herbal antimicrobials I've mentioned. And then a day prior, you want to just be aware of laxatives and digestive aids like hydrochloric acid and enzymes. And I tell people just to stop everything for 24 to 48 hours. And of course, those constipated patients that that really suffer if they're not getting proper bowel movements, it's okay to use some magnesium oxide, I find, but ideally you really want to keep things to a minimum. As you know, there's lots of different fantastic labs out there that offer breath testing, and just be aware of some of the differences in the different labs. So I prefer, this is just coming from my experience, quite strict prep guidelines. More than just eat a low FODMAP diet, because if you have a very strict prep guideline, then you very much minimize your baseline reading, which is really important to keep below 10 parts per million, as you'll see. I find that the higher the baseline creeps up, the harder it is to really interpret the accuracy of a test that you're seeing. Also, you want to go for a test that for 3 hours. I mean, this is my recommendation, but there are other labs that would probably debate that. But I prefer test samples every 15 to 20 minutes throughout the entire 3 hours. There are some labs that do it for 60 minutes and then go to every half hour. So I prefer that. That's my personal preference. And I like to actually see that third hour to see what's going on in the large intestine. Because typically what we think is that not what we think, but what we know at this point is that the first 90 to 100 minutes of a breath test is reading the small intestine. And then anything after that, 100 to 120 minutes is sort of the transition zone from small to large intestine. And then after that is really large intestinal. You're picking up the gases from the large intestine. And that's sort of like, of course, things change if you have somebody with dysmotility. And as we'll see later, there are reasons to think that you can stretch that out a little bit, case by case basis. But total time 3 hours, and the SIBO window is 90 to 100 minutes. Reporting the control of carbon dioxide, or just having a control to make sure that your samples are viable. Typically, the lab picks that up, but I like knowing whether or not that sample was contaminated by room air. I just like that, to know that, and to actually see whether or not a sample was viable. Now, as I've mentioned, that you interpret the breath test results by this test window of 90 to 100 minutes from baseline. At 120 minutes, the transition zone, it is basically present, and you're moving into the large intestine. And after that, it's likely to be a large intestinal contribution. But consider gastroparesis, right? Gastroparesis patients and patients with extreme dysmotility, potentially with like Ehlers-Danlos or scleroderma, you may have to really adjust that time. Now, there is such a thing as a negative breath test result, right? So a lot of times, I know I'm sometimes guilty of that. I see a patient and I'm like, this has got to be a SIBO case. And sometimes the test actually is really surprising. I actually do see a lot of negative cases because I own a breath testing lab, but it is also, sometimes people or practitioners ask me, how else could I interpret this? Is this hydrogen sulfide? No, this is a negative breath test result. You have a low baseline, and you have really no significant rise over baseline. So you see a normal rise after 120 minutes when that substrate hits the large intestine. So this is what a hydrogen positive test result looks like, where, as you can see here, let's see if my pointer, actually, I'm hoping you can see my mouse moving. But basically, you have your sample numbers, number 1 through 10, and that's every 15 to 20 minutes. So you want to get a reading, and you have your baseline, and the patient actually does the baseline first, and then they consume the substrate, and then every 20 minutes, we're getting a sample from the breath. And so here we see at 20 minutes a baseline of 3, or not baseline, but a reading of 3, a baseline of 1. And at 80 minutes, we're seeing this patient just really shoot up. Technically, this person was already positive at 60 minutes because it's 21 parts per million over baseline, which is a positive test result. And then methane, we're going to get into methane in a minute, but this person definitely has intestinal methanogen overgrowth as well, where we're really seeing a very high level. So hydrogen rise of 20 parts per million by 90 to 100 minutes. Methane is a little bit less clear-cut than that. So what's come out of that North American consensus is that methane is considered positive at 10 parts per million or greater anytime during the test. But the problem with that is that not everyone with high methane is constipated. So I would say really, I mean, we're naturopathic physicians, we're functional practitioners. You can also consider other reasons for that constipation. So I'm a little bit more cautious with the diagnosis, but this is the guideline, is that if you have somebody positive at any point in the test of 10 parts per million, and then, you know, I have patients that basically started with, let's say, 50 parts per million, and we've brought them down to 15, and they're no longer constipated, and we may actually stop treatment at that time. So this is a bit more fluid in my mind. And part of that is also because methane can be detected in 30 to 50% of healthy adult population worldwide. So this is a little bit of a problem when we're doing cut and dry kind of diagnosis with methane. It also increases with age, and we'll talk about SIBO versus IMO. The new preferred term for the presence of methane on a breath test is IMO, or intestinal methanogen overgrowth. And I think we're starting to see some movement into that nomenclature more in the literature as well. Part of that is because SIBO really denotes that it's a bacterial overgrowth, which is, of course, with methane already wrong, because methane is not a bacteria. It's part of and it's actually an ancient organism called archaea. It's in that particular kind of group. So, but we'll look at the old kind of, it's still used by some labs, the old sort of SIBO methane. And remember that methane production and what we don't yet know exactly is the time frame of how long it takes for methane to be produced. So we know it can be pretty quick for hydrogen, and then up to about an hour. Hydrogen production with the lactulose or glucose or fructose, but then you produce methane from that. That's a little bit still, we don't quite know the exact number of minutes it takes for that. So there is a bit of a time frame issue with that. So other factors that influence methane test results is that if your patient has H. pylori, that can falsely elevate methane. Proton pump inhibitors can lower methane output. And then also if you're using a probiotic that uses bifidobacterium, or that contains bifidobacterium infantis, can also affect breath testing. So just be aware of those limitations or factors that influence methane. But let's talk about what it looks like on a test result. So in this case, this is still the old way of diagnosing it, where we see a baseline of methane at 39, and it goes up to 68 after just 20 minutes. But we're seeing it kind of waffle around. We're seeing it stay at 60, and then it kind of goes down back to 43, and it goes back up. So is it really SIBO? Is that methane really in the small intestine, or is it intestinal methanogen overgrowth, which basically means it could be anywhere in the digestive tract, including the colon? And we're just seeing this contribution of methane. But this is the older, and it's still used by some labs, that we're seeing a rise of methane. But in any case, this is an intestinal methanogen situation. This is more classic, where we're not seeing any rise at all, and we're seeing definitely methane 10 parts per million or higher all the way throughout this person's test results. So what we also see is when you start, let's say you have a combined hydrogen and methane. So we have this person be positive for SIBO, but also IMO. So on the test results, the first test results, and then after 7 weeks of treatment, this was actually my patient, we reduced methane by almost 70 parts per million, but you can see that on that second test result, that hydrogen really shot up. And this demonstrates how methane is one way for the digestive tract to concentrate gases. And I've mentioned that it takes 4 hydrogens to make 1 methane, and that's really what we're seeing. So when you're reducing methane, this is often the result is that you see this, it's not often this extreme, because I usually also use hydrogen antimicrobials, but sometimes you see this, where you see this drastic increase of hydrogen, even though methane is reducing. So this is not anything to worry about, but you now go to second phase of hydrogen treatment in this patient. I actually did see this person last week, and she'd exactly had the same situation where her methane, if you can see this here this is actually a test result from Aero Diagnostics, and she did have IMO. Her baseline, I think, was a non-viable, let's see, yep, when it says too high, it's a non-viable sample. But we start seeing at 20 minutes at 38, and it kind of goes, waffles around a little bit as well, but it really stays in the upper 20s and 30s. And then her hydrogen was single digits only at 20 minutes. She had this little blip there. That was actually her first sample. So we treated her. She also had other issues. This was actually a glucose test. So, and I think she had, I'm trying to remember now if I ordered this, I ordered the follow-up, but the intestinal issues were not just limited to constipation and all that. So I also ordered an organic acid test. I really like that test for assessing fungal markers. So she did have quite high levels of arabinose and other fungal markers. So we did a 3 months treatment. And here you can see the same phenomenon where her methane really has reduced and her hydrogen sort of increased. So we're now adding in some extra for her hydrogen whilst we're also treating her fungal overgrowth and continuing with methane. But as you can see here, her methane is still considered positive, but she was like her constipation was almost resolved. So it's not always that you need to drive it down below 10, in my experience. So other people may have other types of experiences in practice. This is the Trio Smart from Gemelli. And this is their sample actual test results. And so this is the only lab that we have right now for assessing hydrogen sulfide on a breath test. And I really, really hope the technology advances so that other labs have possibilities to test, to offer testing, because we need more testing availability. And we also need to understand reference ranges a bit more, and so for that reason we need more tests, really. So this is a lactulose test, and they also do hydrogen and methane and hydrogen sulfide. And as you can see, here are the reference ranges for hydrogen sulfide. It's been adjusted a couple times, so I think it's still working out some kinks, but this is the Trio Smart that's available as well. Yeah, only in America if you're overseas. So I don't have access to that. Only with my American patients can I order that. This is what we used to do and we still do. We look at the breath test and see if it's suggestive of hydrogen sulfide. Now remember what that graphic I had of stool patterns that is more associated with hydrogen sulfide. What we see typically in patients that are hydrogen sulfide dominant SIBO, they have much more of a diarrhea picture, looser stools. If they're more constipated, I doubt that this would be a hydrogen sulfide SIBO picture. It may be hydrogen sulfide overgrowth in the large intestine in addition to SIBO. But so what we used to do is just knowing that hydrogen and methane are they kind of work hand in hand with using hydrogen to produce methane. We knew that there was a third gas, hydrogen sulfide, but for a long time we couldn't measure it, and we still can't measure it in many parts of the world. And so looking at a lactulose breath test that really is more or less single digits in hydrogen and really zeros for methane can be suggestive of hydrogen sulfide. And that's where I would also go by symptoms. So if this person is more on the constipated side, I'd probably say follow it up with another test substrate, as I've mentioned before. Maybe consider glucose, consider fructose as well before you just diagnose this person with hydrogen sulfide. Okay, so let's talk about, I've already alluded to the breath test. You want to have a really good baseline, low baseline, as low as you can get it, like definitely below 10 of hydrogen. And so what happens if you get a high baseline? My first thought is, okay, you may have a diet that's too high in fermentable carbohydrates. They really didn't stick to the prep diet. But also there's some evidence to suggest that oral bacterial overgrowth may contribute to some of these cases of high baseline. And there is this couple years old study that showed that basically before and after testing and looking at total gas levels, before and after oral mouth rinse, showed a reduction in some cases of total gas levels. So there are hydrogen producers in the mouth. There are methane producers also in the mouth. And you can see here that post mouthwash, the pre and post levels were quite significantly different in some of those cases that had a baseline. This was really specifying high baseline patients. So that was very interesting. And it makes sense that if you have an oral contribution, that may really influence your readings. So the rise of the third hour of a breath test, I love those because, well, I don't love them, but I like it because it really gives me a clue that this may be more of a LIBO or large intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And I'm, in my line of work, I work almost exclusively with functional digestive disorders. I almost always add a complete digestive stool analysis or any kind of assessment of microbiome in my patients, whether that's shotgun genomics or PCR testing, and look at their digestive. I'm a really big tester with functional tests. So when I see that, I'm like, okay, well, we do need to assess the large intestine and see what's going on there. So that's always a nice clue. So anything over like 100 or pushing up 80, 90, you might want to look at hydrogen production. And we're not measuring hydrogen in the large intestine, but you know that there are hydrogen producers, E. coli, Klebsiella, et cetera, that also ferment carbohydrates in the large intestine. As I've mentioned, I really like retesting my patients because I need to know whether or not they have completely cleared SIBO. Now, if your patient comes in and says, you're a genius, I'm cured, I'm 100% better, of course, you don't have to retest. But if your patient says, well, I'm significantly better, but I still have some issues, I would recommend retesting simply because you need to know if what you're still treating is SIBO, because I've seen patients that have come to me that have already been to many practitioners, and they've been on sometimes years of antimicrobials. So we really don't want to do that if we don't need to do that. So you want to do this at the end of your antimicrobial phase, whether that's herbal or whether that's antibiotics. So you want to really test the efficacy of your treatment. And one of the reasons for that is because SIBO is a frequently relapsing condition for many patients. And if they know that they have found a treatment that really works for them, in the future, if they relapse, they can actually just go to that treatment. So this is how my thinking works. You want to then also have a clear set point for clearing SIBO, and then you can wait for the return of symptoms for if they do have autoimmune IBS or or whatever they may have that is giving them a relapse. And it's useful to know this if you are wanting to prescribe prokinetics. So a line of thought is basically you're waiting to see if they're relapsing. If it's taking a year to relapse, they may be better off just doing a booster round of treatment rather than a prokinetic. I hope that made sense. We'll see in the Q&A. If SIBO is cleared and yet the patient is still symptomatic, then you really need to investigate other diagnoses. It's also very helpful to do in the midpoint of elemental diet treatment. And it really, like I said, is effective for, or it verifies effective treatment outcomes. So summary of breath testing is that breath testing is an excellent tool, as I've just mentioned. There are differences in labs in terms of prep recommendations, testing parameters, length of test, and collection devices. So just be aware of that. If the patient has classic SIBO symptoms and you get a negative lactulose test result, consider following up with another substrate to confirm SIBO. Now, there is a blood test, which is more looking at the cause of SIBO rather than diagnosing SIBO. So if a patient has had, for example, a case of gastroenteritis, never been well since, developed IBS type symptoms, and has a positive lactulose breath test, you may want to order this breath test. It's also from Gemelli, I think. And basically, you're looking at antivinculin and anti-CDTB antibodies that are basically produced as a result of a former gastroenteritis infection with either Campylobacter, Salmonella, E. coli, those types of things in the body. Basically causes an autoimmune reaction and a damage to the migrating motor complex, which is the motility in the small intestine that really sweeps out the small intestine of any overgrowth of bacteria. If both antibodies are positive, you have a 97% accuracy of that person having what we call post-infectious IBS or autoimmune IBS. And it doesn't replace a breath test, but one of the things that I like about this test is it really confirms that you do need prokinetics for someone like that, because they have a really slowed down motility. So other testing, I'm just going to very briefly, this is not diagnostic for SIBO. This is just what I do. I do look at organic acid tests. I do look at liver function tests, zinc, B12 status, iron panel, all of which can be affected by the presence of SIBO. And I do CDSA. I particularly look at digestive markers. As you'll see, that's a big category of underlying causes for SIBO. I do look for fecal fat because of bile acid deconjugation with SIBO. So it's a really good adjunct test to add on to your patient. And then I do shotgun genomics to look at oral species that are present in the stool, potentially indicating that they may have some issues with hydrochloric acid or also presence of Akkermansia and other sort of metabolites, particularly hydrogen sulfide and histamine, which is a big problem in many of my patients. Now, I'm aware of timing, which theoretically I only have about 5 or 6 more minutes. So I'll just I'll go through this rather quickly. But again, as I've mentioned before, as a naturopathic physician, or if you're a functional practitioner, obviously you're interested in treating somebody's underlying cause. And this is really where I think the sweet spot is for our profession, is that we can really help these people out. So you got to think about 3 different ways that SIBO can be caused, not by condition, but by dysfunction of the small intestine. So number 1 is impaired digestion. So this person may be very severely achlorhydric or really hypochlorhydric. They may have very poor bile flow. They may have issues with pancreatic enzymes. Those juices of hydrochloric acid, bile, and pancreatic enzymes do provide a lot of bacteriostatic activity to the small intestine. And if there is a real compromise in these juices, it's logical that it would also impact what can overgrow in the small intestine. So think about impaired digestion, and then impaired motility, where either the migrating motor complex or something going on with vagal tone and the enteric nervous system where food is not propagated properly through the small intestine, and bacteria are not cleared out efficiently, and basically things are fermenting in a more stagnant digestive environment. So impaired small intestinal motility. And then thirdly, you can have impaired outflow where you have really anatomical kinks in the garden hose because of adhesions or scar tissue. You can have strictures, you can have issues with how things kind of move from point A to point B, and really sort of a dysmotility based on adhesions and structural deficits. So the way I kind of group this then, if we're looking at motility, digestive deficits, and outflow, if you look at motility, you can have this autoimmune IBS or migrating motor complex damage, as I've mentioned, from previous gastroenteritis, where you really have a neurological damage to the MMC. You can also have impaired motility that's not necessarily linked to the MMC, but with traumatic brain injury, also hypothyroidism, we know that affects motility. Chronic infections or stealth infections can also affect vagal tone and can affect the enteric nervous system. Diabetes, obviously because of glycation issues, and mold or chronic inflammatory response syndrome, dysautonomia, and scleroderma, and I'll go through some of the main issues with those conditions and how they impair motility. But dysautonomia, that's a whole nother category of issues where we see multiple problems in those patients with Ehlers-Danlos, POTS, and mast cell activation syndrome. And then, of course, scleroderma, where things can just not propagate through the small intestine. With digestive deficits, that's our wheelhouse, right? We know how to treat that, but we see microbiome dysfunction, chronic stress, fight or flight issues that affect digestion. We see secretory IgA deficiencies of pancreatic enzymes or brush border enzymes, poor bile flow and low stomach acid. And then we also have this problems with endometriosis, adhesions, EDS, anything that affects the structure. And then we have some medications that do affect the motility mainly of the intestinal tract, and they are listed here, and finding alternatives for that obviously can also be helpful. We know how to do this. I just want to mention a few things here is that brush border enzymes can be a real game changer for people with SIBO, and that's because brush border enzymes provide that last crucial step after pancreatic enzymes have already worked their magic on macronutrients and have unraveled those a little bit. And brush borders do that last step of breaking down disaccharides and polypeptides, etc. So brush borders can be damaged directly by the gases. So using brush border enzymes can be really helpful, and they're often included in many of the plant-based formulas, and also mainly the plant-based formulas. And then also diamine oxidase is a particular enzyme that helps to break down food-based histamine that can also just be useful in helping. And then obviously you've got your cholagogues and oxbile, and like artichoke. Artichoke is a great cholagogue, but also a motility agent. So we know how to treat digestive disorders for sure. And then in terms of impaired motility, going back to that, as I've mentioned, the migrating motor damage, but also poor vagal tone. I've been working a lot with patients with that have mold issues, that have chronic fight or flight, that have adverse childhood events, trauma, you name it. I think there's a lot more talk about using very specific vagal stimulators and stress reduction techniques. Hypnotherapy, especially gut-centered hypnotherapy, I think is also super helpful. And then ENS impaired, specifically, I wanted to mention mycotoxins. So this is how, when you have a chronic mold patient that's basically continuing to have SIBO, just maybe focus on treating mold first, because mycotoxins are just extremely toxic to the mesenteric plexus. And there's lots of other reasons why we see chronic SIBO with these patients. Also, stealth infections, reactivated EBV, anything that actually is involved in neurological tissue I've experienced can also have a lot of focus on digestive symptoms. And any kind of thickening or alteration of gut lining causing impaired motility waves. We see this obviously in IBD with strictures and thickening and scleroderma and EDS. This is just a quick slide on the autoimmune issue where we're seeing elevated antibodies. The structural abnormalities, also don't forget small intestinal diverticulitis, people that have had GI tract surgeries, anybody with an ileocecal valve resection, and then, just remembering that a lot of the surgeries, we kind of forget that a patient may have had that, like a laparoscopy even, or a C-section, or a hysterectomy, an appendectomy, bowel obstruction repair, cholecystectomy, back or hip surgery, and a gastric bypass. So these are pretty common surgeries that we see. And just remember this whole adhesion connection that can be an underlying cause to SIBO. Okay, I think I made it in just time. I just wanted to briefly mention, I do have a monthly podcast, and you can find me on these different platforms. And then also I do have a mastery program that I'm revising right now. But it is a fully comprehensive program on how to treat SIBO and its underlying causes, and we go into lots of different aspects of treatment in that course. So thank you very much for your attention.
Dr. Jacoby, thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. If people do want to access this, there they are. Okay, perfect. So those are the resources, how to find Dr. Jacoby. And y'all, if you do have any questions, we're going to hop right into Q&A. So go ahead and use that Q&A button down in the menu bar, and we can ask Dr. Jacoby. And if you have to jump, no worries at all. Just to reiterate, we are recording this session, and then following the Q&A, I'll show you exactly how to order the SIBO tests directly on Rupa Health. So with that, let's jump in, and I'm going to do these questions chronologically. And again, just to reiterate, if you do have any questions, hop in that Q&A at the bottom of your menu bar, and we will go ahead and ask Dr. Jacoby. So the first question we have is, hello, is IMO for IBS constipation?
Yes. So IBS has lots of other causes, right? But yes, IBS-C with a methane presence is considered IMO.
Perfect. Do you suspend digestive enzymes and bile salts prior to testing? Also the same for liver detox supplements.
Because there is like a 24-hour prep period, I usually just say, just stop everything for 24 hours. There's no harm in doing that every now and then. That's my personal recommendation, obviously excluding prescriptions that are very important. But yes, I would definitely suspend enzymes and bile acids. And then liver detox, I would still consider, because the prep diet, if you look at the prep diet, it's basically what we do at SIBO test is basically just rice and chicken and olive oil is pretty much it, and some other vegan options, but there's no vegetables, there's nothing. And so I don't really actually want anything else in there. That's my personal opinion. And so you can judge that. I personally tell people to stop everything for 24 hours before the test.
Yeah, makes sense. We had a few questions coming in about the different substrates and your opinion on them. So have you seen a difference when using the different substrates? Do you have a preference between either of the lactulose or the glucose?
So lactulose is my preferred one, no doubt. And that's sort of, also the North American consensus talked about that. And more data is coming out that lactulose is actually very accurate. Mm-hmm. If glucose made it all the way to the terminal ileum, I would love that, and I would prefer glucose, but it isn't, but I have definitely seen negative lactulose and positive glucose. So just consider that when you see a negative and you're highly suspective of SIBO.
I know that you mentioned Gemelli earlier, and they test for, I believe it's hydrogen sulfide. Is that correct?
That's right. Well, they do all three.
They do all three, correct. Yeah.
3 apart, and they do all three gases. Yeah.
Do you see, and I know that's relatively new science that they're coming out with, right? They're the first kind of test out there that tests for all three. Do you see that being more accepted in the SIBO world in testing moving forward?
I think so. I think we're all really hanging out for a, for more conclusive evidence and more confirmatory tests and things like that. It's fantastic that we have this test available now. Yeah. But with any new test, me personally, I'm always like, okay, let's make sure that it's, I love that test, don't get me wrong, but I would love to see it in other, not just one lab in the country. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So, but the data I think we just need to get more data in. And I do order that test for my patients that are America based. So, I'll probably leave it at that.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have a preferred test for fungal overgrowth?
So, I'd say that stool tests are almost like useless for really being conclusive in presence or absence of fungal overgrowth, in my experience. And I've done this for so long that if it's really there, to me, that's a concern on the stool test, right? If it's not there, that doesn't mean it's not there. So I love stool tests, but I don't rely on them for my candida or other fungal overgrowth diagnosis. So I wish there was better testing. I really do. I do use a lot of organic acid testing besides the fungal markers, but I do find that to be actually clinically quite accurate. And I do before and after testing too, and we can really see arabinose come down after treatment, and we can see if treatment is resistant. So I have come to really like that test a lot.
Great. This is a situational one. So this practitioner has a dementia patient trying to cure herself on huge doses of kombucha, kimchi. Just sounds like, yep. SIBO test denies symptoms, but has bloating, can't swallow well. Do you think they're overdosing on high fermentable foods?
Well, some people really can tolerate a lot, but and they're all different ones. So if it's a kombucha is more of a beneficial yeast, whereas fermented vegetables is mostly Lactobacillus plantarum. So we're seeing different ones, but I just don't think that's necessary to do. We know they don't really repopulate. This is still sort of out there in the social media that you're just kind of putting good bacteria back in. They're modulators. We know that about beneficial bacteria, but there's lots of other foods that are more prebiotics. So this is what I would focus on. If that person is concerned about their microbiome, talk about prebiotics, do a shotgun genomics test and look at what's actually there and what can be promoted rather than using foods, because you're not populating anything with that.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense.
That makes sense.
Yeah. How long would you do a prokinetic for after antimicrobials used successfully?
That's a great question. So it really depends. If they have, a positive IBS smart, if they or have really severe dysmotility, they may have to be on it for quite a long time. And I usually, if they're clear for about 6 months to a year, they can see what happens when they get off of it, depending on if it's a natural or a prescription. But I also find that a lot of the times people do build up a tolerance to prokinetics, and after 3 to 6 months, they need to be rotated. That's really not uncommon.
Yeah. Would you consider serotonin imbalance a cause of dysmobility?
So it's a good question, because serotonin is one of the neurotransmitters of motility, but there are others, right? It's not the only one. There's acetylcholine, there's dopamine, there's GABA. They're all involved to some extent. Mm-hmm. Short answer is yes, you could see more constipation. I don't really see SIBO with that, right? So you could potentially, if I have somebody that has lots of depression and constipation, and potentially, on the organic acid test, there are some markers, or let's say I do something like the shotgun genomics, that where I get metabolites and I see a low IPA and low, I think that's often a marker for that. So I kind of mix and match my tests and more confirmatory, but I wouldn't just say yes, that's for sure the underlying cause.
So as what I guess would be considered an international practitioner, right? A lot of these companies are based in the US. What tests, are there specific tests that you prefer? And which tests would you recommend for our international practitioners? Not that you have to be an international practitioner expert by any means, but I guess how has your experience been as an international practitioner working with some of these organizations that offer SIBO tests?
Ooh, I don't know if I want to get into that hot water. I don't think I practice in Australia, but I'd say about 50% of my patient base is in America. In Australia, we're an exclusive company to Australia, so we don't offer any breath testing. We do case by case, it just surrounds. But I'm not quite sure I understand even the question in terms of what testing I recommend internationally, because I find that most of the big labs, whether that's Genova or, even, Aero Diagnostics is a fantastic lab. They also have, they offer testing through, I think it's, BioHealth in the UK. So there's different big labs that still provide testing to international patients, or practitioners, I should say.
Yeah, absolutely. There's different channels that you can reach out to, whether it's through Rupa, and I know there's, I think Nordic Labs as well is another one.
Nordic is in Europe. That's right.
Yeah, there's different channels that can potentially help with that. And then the last couple questions we have time for, or I guess final question we have time for, what shotgun genomic, I know you just mentioned this one, but what shotgun genomic microbiome testing companies do you like?
Okay, so just for those of you who don't know what shotgun genomics is, so, typically, like if we look at stool testing, it used to be, God, remember 25 years ago, all we had was cultures and we thought we knew so much. Well, we knew so little, so little about the microbiome. And it's really come a long way. Then we had PCR testing, which basically just checks the presence of microbes against a list. And shotgun genomics just looks at all the genetic material that's in that microbiome and can actually see which genes are upregulated for which metabolites, which is super useful with histamine intolerance, also ammonia production, all of that. So the lab that I use is called Microba, and they're actually 2 hours north of me. And I believe they also provide the Microbex or something for Genova, I believe. Okay. So they're a fantastic test that I use a lot. And so the downside of shotgun genomics is that you don't really get any digestive markers or inflammatory markers or any of that. So you still have to get that as well.
Dr. Jacoby, thank you so much for your time this afternoon for you, this evening for the rest of us. Do you have any final thoughts for the folks who are sticking around?
Well, if I've got a few more minutes. If somebody has a burning question,
I think you were able to get through all of them. You were
really the Q&A. I see 13 questions there.
Burned them all. There was one about fungal treatment. If you want to put that, do you have a fungal treatment?
I really like nystatin or Nilstat. I really like it. Prescription. It's microbiome sparing. That's sort of my preferred one if they really can tolerate it, because it's quite strong. And then I also like oregano oil, and I like caprylic acid. Those would be my top 3 probably.
Perfect. What about LIBO? I know that you touched on LIBO a little bit. Do you have a treatment for LIBO? And this is
that's like LIBO is basically, it depends on what you're finding, and that's just often an imbalance, and you really need to get the microbiome back in order first. I like oftentimes, unless it's a real pathogen, but sometimes people are treating Klebsiella at a +3 where that may not be the priority. Somebody is asking, rifaximin, is it enough to cure emo? No, it's not enough. So you can combine rifaximin with like high dose garlic. I should clarify high dose garlic extract, which is high allicin. So you don't want just pure like garlic, because garlic is a high FODMAP. That's probably my preferred combination there. And then somebody typed in iberogast for a motility agent. For mild dysmotility, yes, but for severe dysmotility, that's not going to work very much in my experience.
And then we have one last one that said how to treat HS.
Hydrogen sulfide. According to Dr. Pimentel, I think it's also rifaximin. And then naturopathically, or like this, like that actually is been so fascinating for me, because I see a lot of people that have multiple sensitivities, and some people are severely sensitive to sulfur. And when you test them, especially in stool tests that do measure hydrogen sulfide producers like Bilophila wadsworthia or Desulfovibria or Fusobacteria, in those populations that are sulfur sensitivity and high hydrogen sulfide, what the missing link is this actually potentially an upregulation of the body to overcompensate for sulfur deficiency. And I have a podcast that I did with Dr. Greg Nye, a few years ago that talks about this. And I do see a correlation of people that are poor detoxifiers and things like that. So it's not always about killing, unless it's about really a severe hydrogen sulfide overgrowth. So I just want to kind of plant that seed that yes, it's treatable, and we usually do high dose oregano, and we do bismuth, and we do other things, all mentioned in the SIBO mastery course. That's just a shameless plug for me. So that's sort of the fine tuning of treatment.
I love it. We had one more question coming in. Would you use 5-HTP in ginger for IBS-C?
Yes, I've used that. With not exclusively, right? So that I have done tons of 5-HTP, and honestly, I'm like, if you're only using it for a motility agent, maybe other people have had other experience, but I've gone up to, I think I usually do 200 at night, and I just I think there's a reason why they're so low. So look at things like glyphosate levels. We know that affects tryptophan metabolism, and stuff like that.
Amazing.
I think that's pretty much all I can say about that for now.
I love how you can just kind of hop in and do the extra time is amazing. So I appreciate you going off script here. It's perfect. You're getting a lot of love in the chat. So
thanks, guys.
These types of conversations and having guest speakers coming in, and you're not a direct representative of any lab. It's fantastic to get your thoughts and opinions on such an important topic. So thank you again, Dr. Jacoby. Check her out, the SIBO Doctor podcast. I'm assuming it's on all streaming services. They can find it.
It is. Yes, we've actually going into our 6th year this year.
Wow.
So we have a lot of great stuff in the archives. Dr. Anderson on infection, chronic viral infections and gut issues. We've got Dr. Stephen Sandberg Lewis. He's just released a great book on reflux. Check it out. Fantastic stuff that he's done with his book. Lots more to learn about reflux. So yeah, anyways.
It looks like we even already have some fans in the chat as well of the podcast. Check her out, SIBO Doctor. Follow her on socials. Thank you again so much, Dr. Jacoby. This was an absolute pleasure, and I look forward to working with you on some other projects down the line. So what we're going to do, folks, is we're going to transition into a quick demonstration of Rupa. Dr. Jacoby, you're more than welcome to hop off. But if you want to see how our platform works, feel free to stick around. But if you have an extra 10 minutes or so just to jump in, I want to show you exactly what Rupa Health is, who we are, what we do, and why we host these educational webinars every single week. My name is Adrian Martinez, if you missed at the beginning. I'm the head of practitioner partnerships here at Rupa Health. And who we are is we're a functional lab platform. We're created with the goal in mind to simplify an existing process that is very, very manual. So what we do is we aggregate labs for you. So a process that used to require multiple logins, that used to take hours of patient support and admin work, We take care of all of that for you, and you're free to sign up for a platform. So to show you exactly what we do, we work with over 30 different labs and over 3,000 different tests. So no longer do you have to go to each individual lab to place your orders, to manage your results, to take care of your patient experience. You have one single sign-on, and we take care of everything. So what I'm showing you here is the Discover Labs tab. You're able to hop in here and you can browse by category. You can search for tests. You can browse by biomarker. You can see all the different labs we work with as well. So as I mentioned, we work with over 30 different labs. We have multiple different SIBO solutions, the GI tests, genetics tests. We even have basic blood labs on our platform. What's really unique about Rupa Health is the fact that we work with so many different labs. We have tools to make your life a little bit easier, right? For example, if you are interested in seeing what SIBO tests are on the platform, you have this lab test comparison tool. Thank you, Victoria, so much for joining. Always a pleasure to see you in the chat. But you're able to hop in, you can customize this, or you can see, hey, here is the SIBO test. You can see we have 5 different SIBO tests on our platform here at Rupa Health, Genova, Gemelli, Commonwealth as well. And you can see, hey, here's the different costs. We can see what the sample reports look like. We can see the sample collection instructions, what the processing looks like, and even down below, what biomarkers are being tested in each of them. Super simple. We're giving you raw data. We stay agnostic. We're not going to push any particular test on you. You're able to hop on to our platform and see all the information needed. To start an order on Rupa Health, it's as simple as having your patient's first name, last name, and email address. Once you have that input, you're able to go to your order screen. You can create custom bundles, which are sets of tests, sets of blood panels, combination of any test on our platform. You can put it in a single bundle, one click, and they're added into your cart. Down below, you can create a favorites list. So individual tests that you commonly order, you can put a heart next to it, and that way it appears at the top. So when you're ready to order, you can go ahead and order whichever test that you're looking for. So for example, if I want to order that Genova 3-hour, or if I want to order the Gemelli or Commonwealth, I can have those all in my favorites. But maybe I also want to order a GI map from Diagnostic Solutions, right? Or a GI 360 from Doctor's Data. It doesn't matter as long as that test is in a favorite, it's up here at the top. But if you are looking for a specific test, you have access to the whole catalog of over 3,000 tests, 3,003, I believe, to be specific, right down below. So again, you can search for whatever test you're looking for, find that information. If you have any questions, clicking the details to pull up all the relevant information. And when you're ready to place that order, you just go ahead and click send a patient. And that's how simple it is to order from over 30 different labs in one place in a matter of seconds. Again, traditionally, you would have to go create separate accounts with each one of the labs you want to work with, log in, place that order, and then from there, send each individual order to your patients. It's time consuming. Nobody wants to do that. And so we're simplifying that process for you. Our pricing is wholesale practitioner prices. So the same price you would get having an account directly with the labs, those are the same prices that we offer here at Rupa Health. So what that means is that you're not going to be really paying any more money on your labs by working through Rupa Health. The way that we generate our revenue is there's a flat 7% processing and ordering fee on each order. You'll see that broken down as a Rupa service fee, and that's paid for by whoever pays for the tests. So if you're having us manage billing with your patients, then your patients will be the ones paying that 7% fee. In that circumstance, Rupa is free for you. That's the only cost to use Rupa. There's no cost to sign up for Rupa. There's no subscription fee. There's no contract you're signing. This 7% per order is the only cost. Again, if you're having us build a patient, then the patient will be the one paying for that 7%. In that scenario, Rupa is free for you. The alternative being you go ahead and pay for the tests yourself and build a patient separately outside of our platform. Additionally, you even have the option of adding a custom fee to an order as well. So if you do want to add maybe an interpretation fee or a service fee billed to your patient, you can do that as well. And once you press send on that order, we'll take care of that. So a very important component to Rupa Health is the fact that we manage the patient experience end to end. So as soon as you press send on that order, we'll take it from there. Again, we can manage billing with your patients. Once payment has been received, we'll ship the kits directly to your patients. So you don't have to stock any kits in office. We'll ship them to your patients. We'll send over the instructions and FAQs, videos on how to take the test. We'll handle any patient support required. We'll follow up with the patient, and then you're notified as the results come in. So all of your results will be managed as well within Rupa Health. And if you work with an EHR that we integrate with, those results will flow directly into that EHR as well. So this is what it looks like. What's great about Rupa is not only can we accept credit or debit for these tests, but we can also accept HSA, FSA, and we can even set up a 3-month interest-free payment plan with your patients to help pay for the cost of these tests. Alternatively, if you decide to pay for the tests yourself, no worries at all. Nothing changes with the patient experience. We will still take care of the whole patient experience. The primary differentiator here is that we're just not going to show the cost of the test, right? You're paying for the tests. And so with that, we're not going to show the patient the cost. From there, we'll send over an email to your patients outlining all the instructions for their tests, how to fill out the requisition forms. And if they are taking a test that requires a blood draw, we can even help coordinate the phlebotomies. We'll send over all the necessary resources. And if your patient has any questions or needs support, they can reach out to our team. We'll handle any specimen issues. And even if they simply just don't like the phlebotomy options in their area, they can reach out to our team and we will search by zip code to help send over any viable blood draw locations in their area. Again, y'all, this is what Rupa does. We're designed to just make life a lot easier for you. From there, we'll follow up with the patient. Seems so simple, but is also oftentimes a very easily overlooked step within your patient experience. How are you doing? Do you have any questions? Our compliance rates are well above 85%, which are above the industry standard by far. And then you're notified again as the results come in. Once those results are in, you just hop right back into your main Rupa dashboard and you're able to view everything straight away. So you're able to see everything here, all your orders. You can see and track all of your orders. See, for example, when the results arrived, when the samples arrived at the lab, when you can expect them to come in. And from there, you can download the results. You can send the results to your patients. And a really cool feature right now is we even have the ability for you to create what we call essentially a lab process, right? So you can create a follow-up process with your patients. My files didn't upload correctly. It's actually a picture of my dog, which is why it's not showing up. So you're able to hop in, you can create treatment plans, create PDFs, send those directly to your patients. Again, the goal here is just to streamline the existing process and make your life that much easier. You're also able to schedule clinical consultations. So if you do need some assistance interpreting the results, you're able to schedule time with a clinician from the lab that you're working with directly through this button here. Now, the last thing I want to show y'all is the fact that we do a lot of education. You are all gracious enough to join today for Dr. Jacoby's session on SIBO patterns, but this is not a one-time event. We actually host these every single week. So you can see the one we have upcoming next week with Eliza Act. That's going to be a fantastic presentation, but we also always record and upload them in here. So you have a full library and resource center available for you, not just live classes, but also articles. We have a magazine, we have a podcast, we even have boot camps. So if you are interested in getting a bit more of a deep dive, feel free to join one of our boot camps. This is the only other thing that's paid on Rupa. So it does cost $400, but what's great about it is it comes with a test for you to be able to run on yourself. So you'll be able to get sent a GI map, you'll test yourself, and you'll be able to walk through the results alongside the instructors for these boot camps. Super exciting. We love the product. We love education. So with that, y'all, Rupa Health is more than just a place where you can come and order your labs. It's also a place where you can come and learn about your labs and all of your tests from industry experts like Dr. Jacoby, like all of the other representatives from the 30+ labs that we work with. Now, currently, a couple of details about Rupa. We only operate within the US. So unfortunately, if you are an international practitioner working with patients abroad, we cannot service your patients. We are only operational within the US. Now, if you are practitioners whose licenses may be limiting in your ability to order certain tests, we actually have a solution for you. It's called physician services. So physician services, you're able to apply for it. And if there are tests that fall outside of your scope of being able to order directly, we can partner you with a licensed physician who would be able to order those tests on your behalf. So I'll end it there, y'all. But if you do have any questions, here's my contact information. My name is Adrian Martinez. Again, I'm the head of practitioner partnerships here at Rupa Health. My email is just adrian@rupahealth.com. Feel free to reach out if you do have any questions. I'm going to get rid of that one down below. But I appreciate y'all sticking around with me. I know it's late for some of you, maybe even early in the morning for some of you guys around the world. But thank you again so much. We genuinely appreciate you joining us this evening. And if you do have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. I appreciate you and have a great rest of your day or your night. Take care.